Greetings and welcome to Grasscat Tutorials. This is a companion video to the microtutorial on C++ functions. If you aren't familiar with C++ functions, I highly recommend you go and watch that video first. So what I have here is a very simple D&D inspired character creator to represent code that you might actually write. Because usually when introducing functions, either in a class or in a YouTube tutorial sequence, usually the functions introduced are fairly simple, fairly basic things that you probably would never actually write. So just to show real quick what the program does, I am able to set my name. I can set my race between certain limited selections. There is some basic sanity checking of inputs requiring me to put in the correct thing, including, correct values for the stats. And it correctly calculates out the bonuses that the stats would receive. So let's take a look at the code involved in creating this. We'll start off by looking in the header file, which is something that you will commonly need to deal with when handling functions. It is worth reminding you that when you're dealing with header files, you only ever want a header file to be processed once. If you try to process a header file more than once, you will get an error because you will be redefining everything that is inside the header file. That is what the pragma once directive here is doing for us. That is informing the compiler that we only want to link this once. Moving on, I do have to have the string library included because I have some string parameters and return types. I have a sequence of constants that I have defined here, so that way I don't have to use magic numbers. Separate video on that. And then finally we get to the meat of the functions, which is the prototypes. So I have a whole wide range of functions defined here. Unfortunately, there was no real need to come up with a function overload for this particular example, so we won't see any of those. But we've got plenty of other options here. We have functions that have data types being returned out. We have functions that evaluate to void or nothing. We have functions with no parameters. We have functions with one. We have functions with many parameters. We also have functions that are passing by reference and two different ways of passing in arrays. So we've got a nice little range of functions that we can go over. Let's hop over to the CPP file. Jump back up to the top here. Take a look. So we've got a fairly standard selection of include statements here, IOStream and string. IOManip is what I use to do the table-like formatting, and I'll talk about those particular methods when we get to them. And of course, I have my custom created .h file included as well. Dropping down here into main, we have some fairly standard initialization code here. Welcoming the user to the program. I'm going to skip over show character for now. That's the last function that I actually want to go over. And just drop straight into the while loop here. Again, this is a fairly common way of structuring logic. This is an endless loop. This will loop forever until the user selects option 6, which will then call the break statement, which of course breaks you out of any while loop or for loop you happen to be in. This first line here, we have menu choice equals get menu choice. And if we go into that function, remember, right click on a function in Visual Studio, and then you can select go to definition to see the definition of the function. Very useful way for navigating through larger projects. And here we go. We've got just a nice big old clump of cout statements displaying out the options. And then we've got another function call. This time, get choice. And if we go to that one, we can say that this function takes a minimum range and a maximum range as integers for its arguments, and it will endlessly loop until we get an input from the user that matches this range. This is a very common paradigm that you will see in functions. So to go all the way back to the beginning, we've got our main function. From main, we are calling the getMenuChoice function. From getMenuChoice, we are calling the getChoice function. And then from inside getChoice function, technically we're calling more functions because we are calling send.clear and send.ignore. You can chain function calls like this for a good long time before the computer will start getting mad at you. Now, do not be afraid of chaining function calls. It is a fairly standard approach to constructing and putting together a program. Just to briefly go over the logic here, we're grabbing the input. We're checking to see if the input stream has an error in it because the user tried to put like a floating point or a non-numeric value into an integer. Clear out the error, clear out the characters, and we will just continue looping until choice is either equal to or greater than the minimum or less than or equal to the maximum. One quick note about my initialization choice here, int min. Exactly what min is for an integer, or what max is for an integer, for that matter, can vary depending on the system. It should be plus or minus 2 billion, because an integer should be a 32-bit value numeric. That's not guaranteed. By using int min here, instead of manually putting in a variable, I am guaranteed that I am putting in the smallest possible value to initialize choice to, which means that my while loop is properly primed for continuing until I get a valid answer. So we get a valid answer, we return that value, and then of course get choice, which I think I just zipped past. Nope, there it is, get menu choice. Get menu choice just simply returns that value back out again. So we just have two return statements in a row, and then that value gets placed inside this variable here. From there, we go through our menu, where depending on the choice, we'll either call the setName, setRace, setClass, setStat functions. We'll call the showCharacter function, or as I've already mentioned, option 6 will break us out. I want to take a look at setRace and setClass first, because these are choices that I made to demonstrate a point rather than how I would have actually done it. If I was doing this actually how I would have done it, setRace would look the same as setClass. So let's see what's going on with these. So let's hop down to their definition. So setClass is passing in the integer by reference. Remember, when we pass in by reference, we will modify the value of the variable that was used to pass this information in. My favorite analogy is mailboxes. Now, when you pass by value, which is what we are doing here with the lookup stat bonus, you are effectively, imagine you've got this wall of mailboxes. I'm taking a piece of paper out of one mailbox, box 17. I'm grabbing a new piece of paper. I am copying down the information from the piece of paper from box 17. I'm putting that piece of paper back into box 17, and I'm putting the new piece of paper with a copy of the information into the new mailbox. That is pass by value. Anything done to that new piece of paper obviously isn't going to impact the piece of paper that's in box 17. Whereas if I pass something by reference, it's like I've put a sticky note on the new mailbox that says, see box 17. So when I go to grab the piece of paper, I see the sticky note, oh, see box 17. Okay, and I go and grab box 17's piece of paper. It's now been modified. So in this particular case, I pass in the class ID as a reference, so that way I can just simply say, inside of the function, class ID equals get choice from 1 to 3. Whereas in setRace, I am returning the value that getChoice generates, and I will have to assign that wherever the function is called. Both of these functions are correct. Both of these functions are worth writing. Neither of these is more correct than the other. It is personal preference that I would have preferred to have made setRace the same as setClass, honestly, because I think it would look better up here. Having the similarity through the code, I think, would look better. That's it. That's the sole reason. Looks. Functionally, there is no difference between these functions. Moving on with some of the rest of these. Set name, again, same sort of logic. I am passing in a string by reference, so that way whatever name the user types in is just set to that variable. Set stats and show character are a little bit more interesting in that in set stats, I have an int star. In other words, I'm passing a pointer. If you have not covered pointers yet, don't worry about this syntax. It's just another way of passing things around, paying attention to which mailbox or the memory location, instead of copying values around. There will, of course, be a micro-tutorial on pointers as well. But all you need to know is that if I pass an array in here, it works. As you can clearly see, I am referencing stats as an array through here, even though I don't have the angle brackets. Or not angle brackets, apologies, square brackets. Whereas if I go to show character, I have int stats square brackets. I am very explicitly stating I want to see an array. I want an array passed in through here. They have the same identical functionality. You are passing by reference in both instances. If I made a change to stats inside of show character, it would be reflected in the values back in main. Continuing on with actually just looking at the code here, I'm using a lot of lookups, and you'll notice I do this quite frequently. I've got lookup stat. I have a lookup lookup class. I have lookup race. Part of the reason why I've got these lookups, in the case of stat values, I've got an array. I want to be able to know what stat am I accessing clearly, and it just also makes a lot more sense to return out strings instead of having things statically defined. This gives me more flexibility. Now, admittedly, my lookup stat function is a little bit interesting. Again, I wrote it this way for the discussion point, not necessarily that this is how I would approach it. If I was honestly trying to write this program, I would probably pull this array out and put it in my .h file, because this is static information that I don't intend to ever have changed, and there's multiple areas where I might possibly want this information. So yeah, I would probably pull this out and put it in the .h if I didn't want to have it as part of the function for a discussion point. But all I'm doing here is just creating an array, automatically assigning these 6 strings to the 6 elements of the array, validating that this integer is a valid index for the array, and then returning the appropriate stat name, or returning invalid stat if I was given an invalid index number. So a little bit odd, but otherwise nothing too special about it. Taking a look at lookup class and lookup race. Again, a minor point where I'm doing things for discussion purposes rather than how I would actually do it. I am showing off a switch statement and an if-else chain. Both of these are doing the exact same thing. I am taking an integer ID and I am transforming it into a string. Why would I do this? Why would I not just have the string names? Well, partially because integers take up a lot less space to store than strings, and they're a lot faster to process. In this particular example, does it matter? Goodness gracious, no, it does not. But now imagine that I have thousands, maybe I have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of characters to store. I'm running a very popular MMO. Do I want to be storing hundreds of thousands of copies of the word human? Or do I want to store 100,000 integers? I would want to store the 100,000 integers. So this kind of ID, using IDs to look up a string type of combination, is a very common programming approach, and again, is a very probable function that you will someday write in the wild. The final function that I want to go over is showCharacter, because this is where I am using the IO manip library. Set width basically is saying, the next chunk of characters that I output into this stream, regardless of how many there are, it will take up at least 25 characters. Same thing for down here. I'm saying that regardless of how many characters, so actually here would be better, regardless of how many characters, it's going to take up 22. And regardless of how many characters, it's going to take up 10. This is what gives this table-like format on my output. I don't have to guess how many spaces to put in between strength and its value and constitution and its value. I am saying this is always going to be 25 characters, then I will have the 8. So a very useful way of controlling text-based output for a console application. And that would be it. That is the basic character creator. Again, not exactly how I would implement everything, but this is fairly close to the type of code you might actually encounter or that you might actually write for a functional program. Pun not intended. If you found this video useful, well, a thumbs up would be appreciated. And if you didn't really find it all that great, well, the thumbs down button is right next to it. Until next time.